Animal Farm. I have never seen an adaptation that was so afraid of its source material. Look, I get that it's no easy task to adapt George Orwell's satirical allegory of how populist sentiment can give way to totalitarian rule. But, I mean, you could have, tried? Let's take a look at the new Animal Farm movie and compare it to that one SpongeBob episode where they go on strike, and ask ourselves what makes for a great political story. Chapter 1. They cut Pig Karl Marx. So, any adaptation from book to screen is almost always going to change things, simply due to the difference in medium. But this first major change is just baffling. They cut Pig Karl Marx. Like what, you're adapting the farm animals communism book? I don't think the Marx allegory is optional, regardless of your personal feelings about his ideology, Angel Studios. Yeah, I'm sure this omission was completely unbiased and based on just runtime or something. The original book begins with all of the animals gathering to listen to a speech made by Old Major, i.e. Pig Karl Marx, where he makes strong statements about the power imbalance between man and animal, stating such things as, "Man is the only creature that consumes without producing," or "Only get rid of man and the produce of our labor will be our own." Or, one that is particularly relevant today, never listen when they tell you that man and the animals have a common interest, that the prosperity of one is the prosperity of others. It is all lies. The movie has none of that stuff, and instead begins with all the animals being loaded into a slaughterhouse truck since the farm is being foreclosed on. When the animals realize they're being sent to their deaths, they rebel. Compared to the book, where the animals rebel after being a bit underfed, inspired by the, at the time dead, Old Major, this slaughterhouse opening completely undermines the book's original message. I'll probably say a variation of that sentence a lot in this video. In the book, the animals are united under a specific ideology that gives them the foundation to seize control, and the circumstances under which they seize control are much more complicated. While Farmer Jones does slaughter the animals in the book and is neglecting to feed them, there isn't a direct and exact danger that the animals must respond to. They very well could have kept going on in the system they already lived in, as opposed to in the movie where the animals are given a clear-cut choice to rebel or be killed. It lacks all nuance. It reduces the complicated relationship between bourgeoisie and proletariat to a black and white conflict over a simple goal of avoiding certain death. And when it does that, it removes so much from the original metaphor. In the book, the average reader can relate to the animals, feel a connection to when Old Major discusses, for example, the egg-laying hens being robbed of the fruits of their labor, and they can compare that to their own feeling of being underrewarded for their own labor. In the movie, it's just yeah, it's bad when your oppressors try to kill you, an obvious and hollow statement that removes any possibility of the average worker relating to this story. But worst of all, it removes the ability for the audience to imagine their own oppressors in the role of Jones. The book version of Jones, he could be your boss, he could be your country's leader. But the movie version? Well, unless you're actively being targeted for execution, there's really no way to put yourself in the position of these animals. And sure, people do get targeted for certain death by their oppressors to this very day, but that's not a guarantee for every single person, not of the 1%. Unlike the theft of surplus labor as described by Old Major, which is happening to every member of the working class. And if I were to ask the people behind this movie why they omitted Pig Karl Marx and why they opted for this slaughterhouse opening, they'd probably give an answer along the lines of, "We wanted the story to be easier to understand for all ages." And beyond my first rebuttal to that, which would be maybe Animal Farm fundamentally doesn't work as a PG-rated kids movie, I would argue that one can have a strong political, even a socialist message in a piece of kids media. And I truly think there's no better example of that then Squid on Strike. The beginning of Squid on Strike elegantly sets up the idea of class struggle in a way that both adults and kids can understand. See, I know that an average child isn't really going to understand collegiate level topics such as capital interests, worker solidarity, and all those other fun phrases that would get you blacklisted in the 1950s. But there is one phrase that anyone of any age past cognitive development can understand. That's unfair. And Squid on Strike's opening scene paints that picture of unfairness quite well, with the whole Mr. Krabs charges his employees for things like standing and breathing thing. This situation is just cartoonish enough to be something that no one has ever experienced, but at the same time reads as something we have all experienced. One can take this absurd demand by Krabs and apply it to something unfair in their own lives. Whether that be an adult problem, like having to pee in water bottles because of strict delivery quotas, or a kid problem, like your parents asking you to do the dishes more often than your siblings. And that's the main difference between the opening of Squid on Strike and the opening of the Animal Farm movie. Relatability. Because we don't relate to the overly high stakes in the opening of the Animal Farm movie, we don't end up applying it to our own lives. But perhaps that's exactly what the movie wanted to do. Chapter 2. The personal and the political. Something about the original Animal Farm book is that it is much more political allegory than it is a narrative. It absolutely is a narrative, sure, but it doesn't necessarily contain the same sorts of character arcs and plot beats that are expected in a modern feature film. It's for this reason, I think, that the Animal Farm movie introduced a more standard protagonist who was not a character in the original book, Lucky, who basically functions as a blank slate POV for us to see the story to. I'm not completely opposed to the idea of crowbarring in a protagonist into the story of Animal Farm so it can properly function as a feature film. In fact, it could have been a good idea as it adds a more personal story to this political allegory. For example, Squid on Strike is as much a personal story as it is a political one. Sure, the characters represent specific political archetypes, with Krabs being the bourgeoisie, Squidward being the informed proletariat, and SpongeBob being the uninformed proletariat, and the relationship between these groups drives the story. But beyond that, Squid on Strike deals deeply with the personal feelings of these characters. SpongeBob finds himself torn between his desire to keep his job and his loyalty to his friend, which informs his radical actions at the end of the episode. And the conflict between Krabs and Squidward is as much a clashing of their own personal pride and ego as it is a clash of ideology. Look, I think political elements of stories can be great because they can inform us on how we can vote correctly and how we can properly argue for better positions. But deeper political understanding is only something we need to use in the voting booth or while writing an essay and while arguing with the most insufferable person in your family at Thanksgiving. Personal morals that we gain from the personal lessons of stories like these are things that we live by every day. And it's for that reason that most mainstream visual media, even very political ones, have a balance between the personal and the political. The original Animal Farm, being an 80-page novella, is not bound to that same standard, and instead opts for a mostly purely political narrative. The two most major figures of the story, Snowball and Napoleon, aren't characters with the same sort of personal arcs as what we are used to in most movies and TV shows. They're meant to represent near-exact parallels to certain kinds of political figures, and because most personal elements of them are left intentionally vague, one can apply their behaviors to contemporary political figures, making the statements of the book timeless. Animal Farm, the movie, with its protagonist Lucky, doesn't succeed at adding the necessary personal element to this story, because Lucky doesn't have any specific wants that make him a relatable character. What is it about the rebellion and the events of this story that change his perspectives? Well, not much, because the ideologies that one is supposed to be exposed to through the story have been sanded down to the most milquetoast abusing power is bad tropes imaginable. And Lucky is there to further obfuscate those ideologies by adding in some pointless moments, like him seeing Napoleon as a dad figure and feeling so betrayed that he would be so mean to him, or him crushing on some girl pig or whatever. They also tried to give book original character Napoleon a more personal reason as to why he does some of the things he does, with a scene where some humans laugh at him because he's pig. That's the motivation for why he became Pig Stalin? Seriously? In some ways, I get it. I'm sure all authoritarians do what they do because of personal insecurities. Case in point, this asshat. But you gotta do a little bit better than just some light pointing and laughing. It's also clunky and shallow. It's so obvious that whoever wrote in this plot point was just arbitrarily adding in this is where Napoleon snaps moment so that this movie can do anything other than actually discuss socialism. Chapter 3. Language. Something that makes Squid on Strike stand out as the political SpongeBob episode is how it does not shy away from socialist language.
The gentle laborer shall no longer suffer from the noxious greed of Mr. Krabs.
This not only makes the episode way funnier, what with this cartoon Squid using such charged phrases as
"We are workers united," and "they are a symbol of our oppression,"
but the uses of these phrases also shows that the episode is not afraid of its subject matter and is willing to talk about it head on. The Animal Farm movie, on the other hand, is terrified of its subject matter, which is why it goes through such lengths to avoid addressing it. There are so many things the Animal Farm movie adapted incorrectly to the point where I just cannot get to all the book inaccuracies and how they undermine the story. Let me know your favorite contradiction I missed in the comments below. But the plot device that I think was handled the absolute worst way possible was the 7 Commandments. So in the original book, Pig Karl Marx gives a set of specific rules for the animals to follow so that they don't end up like the humans. Throughout the story, these 7 commandments get revised and bastardized in order to accommodate Napoleon's authoritarian rule. The first thing the movie gets wrong involves the first and second commandments, which read, number 1, whatever goes upon 2 legs is an enemy, and number 2, whatever goes upon 4 legs or has wings is a friend. In the movie, they simply write, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. Now this phrase is also in the book, but the phrase is actually painted above the 7 commandments later on, because some of the more illiterate animals are unable to understand the bigger sentences of the commandments. This feeds into the book's main theme about how illiteracy can lead to authoritarianism. See, the population of the farm isn't able to fully comprehend the rules around them, and thus they aren't able to point out when rules are broken or suddenly changed. Napoleon, in the book, takes advantage of that by quietly adjusting the rules and, in true Orwellian fashion, acting as though those rules had always been that way. Starting small by changing the rule, no animal shall sleep in a bed, to no animal shall sleep in a bed with sheets, and then later much more consequentially change, no animal shall kill another animal, to no animal shall kill another animal without cause. Now, the movie does some of this, but in the wrong order. Not only do we not have the initial 4 legs good, 2 legs bad addition to the commandments, instead having it just replace the first 2 commandments from the very beginning, but the first rule change in the movie is actually what ends up being the second to last rule change in the book, which is the change to 4 legs good, 2 legs better, which is how Napoleon justifies the pigs walking on 2 legs and thus separating his own in-group as the dominant power on the farm. To have the 2 legs better change occur before the beds with sheets change completely undermines the actual way that authoritarians start by taking an inch and eventually take the whole mile. But the most egregious misuse of the book's original language comes from how the movie handles the final commandment. All animals are equal. At the very end of the book, Napoleon has changed this to all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And by that point in the story, all the other commandments are gone, leaving only this one statement that reinforces that the animals had now adopted the exact same class distinctions they had fought against in the beginning, while still pretending like there is some kind of equality around them. And where is the most important line in the story located in this movie? Well, it's announced by Napoleon to a crowd of humans, because it's like a speech where they're opening a hydroelectric dam because of this one CEO lady who's been pulling a lot of the strings so that the movie can drop the nuanced socialist message of its source material in favor of this generic greed bad message, and I hate it, I hate all of this. Like, why would any of these humans care about the some animals are more equal than others statement? I know humans are animals biologically, but for the purpose of this metaphor, they aren't. In Animal Farm, animals means the proletariat. So when the commandment says all animals are equal, it means all members of the proletariat are equal. The bourgeoisie, represented by humans in this story, have nothing to do with that statement, other than the fact that they are excluded from it, which is the point. I genuinely think that the team behind the movie knew they had to include the all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others line in the movie somewhere, so they intentionally chose to put it at the moment where it would have the least impact. Chapter 4. Messaging. The emotional climax of both the Animal Farm book and movie is the death of Boxer the horse. Boxer represents the ideal worker, always willing to do more for the good of others, but his major character flaw is his ignorance and illiteracy, which is why he falls for Napoleon's propaganda. What makes Boxer's death such a tragedy is that he gave so much of his life to helping others, but as soon as he was no longer able to work, he is shipped off to the glue factory. Boxer's death in the movie falls flat because of how much the movie was disinterested in examining the systematic issues that led to his death, and instead opted for a much less impactful, "Horsey was my friend and now he's dead." Wah. And then they use Boxer's death as a way for Lucky to be like, "Wait, Napoleon, you're evil? What?" Then the ending of the movie completely deviates from the book, with a whole thing where they blow up the dam, Napoleon drowns, and the rest of the animals are like, "What do we do now?" And then Boxer, who was narrating the movie from like heaven or whatever, goes, "They've just gotta trust in the stars." And then I remembered that this movie was made by a Christian studio. Look, it's okay for people to have their own personal faith. I think it can be a wonderful thing for so many people. But I don't think looking to the stars is going to provide practical solutions on how to remove authoritarians from power and build a more equitable system where the working class gets to enjoy the fruits of their labor. Of course, they don't literally mean look to the stars. I know they're talking about Jesus. And you know what? I can be inclined to agree with this Jesus fella on all the nice stuff he said about helping the poor and the sick. But let's be real here. When Angel Studios, who previously produced the QAnon-adjacent movie The Sound of Freedom, say, "Listen to Jesus," they really mean, let's pass anti-trans legislation, or let's not tax the rich, or let's make healthcare needlessly complicated and expensive. I mean, that stuff's got nothing to do with Jesus or God or stars, but hey, that's doublethink for you. But beyond all that, I despise the ending of the movie because it gives no practical solutions to the systematic problems that the story presents, and instead opts for this magic conch nothing ending. And yes, the original book doesn't end with any sort of solution being implemented either, with the ending of the book being the pigs and humans all meeting up in the farmhouse, and the other animals are not able to tell who is pig and who is man. But the book absolutely makes a prescriptive statement on how the events of the book could have been avoided. Education. Had all the animals on the farm been literate and informed, they would have seen through Napoleon's lies from the get-go. Sound familiar? The movie, other than a few minor moments where Boxer says he doesn't know the alphabet and Lucky says Snowball taught him to read, it doesn't lean into the discussion of literacy at all. And of course it doesn't. Conservatives don't want a well-educated population, because the more well-educated a population is, the fewer conservatives there are. And because they have no real arguments against things like wealth redistribution, they actively avoid and obfuscate ever having such discussions. In a way, they're exactly like Napoleon in Animal Farm, unable to actually justify their positions, but using every trick imaginable to force them through. Anyway, SpongeBob. So the ending of Squid on Strike has SpongeBob take drastic action to destroy the Krusty Krab, just as Squidward was about to succeed in his negotiations with crabs. The character flaw on Squidward's part was how his language far too much radicalized SpongeBob. And one character flaw on SpongeBob's part was him being too naive to understand nuance. Similar to Animal Farm, the book that is, lack of education plays a role in the demise of Squidward's socialist movement. When Squidward tries to win over the public, they're too unintelligent and too addicted to the instant gratification of the Krabby Patty to make any sort of meaningful difference. And SpongeBob's own ignorance causes problems all the way up through to the ending, but leaning away from the political implications of the episode, it also teaches a personal lesson about not acting too rashly in certain situations, as a more peaceful resolution could be right in front of you. Something that applies both to politics and to our own lives. So, in looking at Squid on Strike, Animal Farm the book, and Animal Farm the movie, we can see three different kinds of story. One that more so leans into a personal lesson, one that leans more into a political lesson, and one that says nothing at all. And that is really what the Animal Farm movie's greatest crime is. It said absolutely nothing at all. And you know, that's what makes people illiterate. That's what makes people misinformed. That's what makes people susceptible to an authoritarian strongman winning them over to their cult of personality. Because when your story says nothing, when it doesn't challenge any preconceived power imbalance or advocate for any practical solutions, it just might be in favor of the opposite. Hey, thank you so much for watching. You really ought to check out some of my other videos right here. See you next time.